Hi crafty friends, it's Donna here, and I've got a set of cards for you today that use stitching dies, both with and without stitching. Today I'm using a couple of flower stitching dies from Paper Rose Studio, and we're going to use both the positive and negative spaces from these dies. I really enjoyed making these. For most of the stitching I used 2 strands of thread. Some of the holes ended up getting used for many stitches, and I didn't want to push it with making the thread too thick. Rather than tie off at the back, I've just taped my thread to the back of the flower and started stitching. You can push the holes out before you start if you like, but I tended to just do it with my needle as I went. I want these stitches to all line up nicely next to each other, and so as I stitch I'm holding each stitch in place. I found a couple of lovely variegated threads, but when I took a strand of the threads, the actual strand that I got wasn't always variegated, so you'll notice me jump around a little bit on the flower. That's just so that I can get the dark and light colours spread around the flower. I worked in from both sides of the petal and made the central stitch the final stitch, so that it would line up and sit nicely. I continued like this all the way around the flower, starting and stopping each thread with tape on the back. I decided to use gold thread for the centre of this flower. It's a much thinner thread, so I'm using more strands. 4 strands, I think. I'm not a fan of this gold thread. I liked how it looked in the end, but it was nasty to work with. I seemed to spend a lot of time detangling, re-straightening, and just generally fussing over the thread. You'll notice that after this flower, I bailed and went back to green for the centres. You've got so many different options of how you can organise these flowers, and I've tried to show you different options on every flower I've stitched. For this flower here, I've used a single hole to take each of my stitches out to the edge of each petal, and now I'm using the in-between holes and running 3 threads out of each to make my centre. If you want your stitching to be more evenly spread around the flower, you can do what I've done on this second flower and use all of the central holes, splitting which ones you go to for each of them. This time for the centre, I've come up each of the central holes and stitched down into the hole which is opposite but one to the left, and also opposite but one to the right. Then I've turned it a hole and repeated that. A little bit like the old spirograph when we were kids. As you get towards the end of this pattern, some of them will only need 1 stitch because it's already been completed by the other end, and this made a beautiful little star in the middle. The third flower is a combination of 2 of the things that we already did. The stitches fanning out for the petals and the spirograph star in the middle, this time going from the bigger holes. Here's another one of the dies that I used. This time I used a variegated red thread, and I used a dark burgundy for the centre. You can see that I split the petals across the centre holes, taking about 5 from each petal into that central hole between the 2 petals, so that the thread fans out beautifully across the whole flower. I made a different centre again, which I thought I'd show you, this time using 3 strands and working from the centre holes outwards. That's enough sewing for now. Let's make some cards. I'm going to use the Happy Stitches papers for some of these because they've got some beautiful bright stripy papers that I think will be perfect with these stars. There are also lots of fun stitched designs, but I didn't get to use those this time. A beautiful big feature like our stitched flower doesn't need much more. So I'm going to cut a few stripes of this warm coloured paper and also a thanks die. The white thanks stands out beautifully against the stripy colours, but not so well against the white, which is why I've cut 2 layers of white and 1 of burgundy, and I've offset the burgundy layer just very slightly, and that just gives a whole lot of definition to the sentiment here. I'm using foam tape to pop everything up because between all of the threads at the back and the tape, I feel like it wouldn't lie flat very well, and with the foam tape being a bit spongy, it covers a multitude of sins. I said we were going to be using both the positive and negative spaces for these. So while we've got this flower out, let's use the negative space. Once again, I'm going to use some stripy paper. This time, cut down to just less than 6 by 6 inches because that's the size of the card I'm going to use. And it turns out that I can cut that so that it's beautiful and symmetrical on that outside colour. Here's the piece that I cut the flower from. And I've cut around that in a square, and I'm going to pop a bit of foam tape on the back. Then it's just a matter of layering that all together and adding a sentiment. The sentiment for today is from these Super Day sentiments, and I'm going to stamp it a few times, because if I'm going to go to the bother of getting the ink out, I may as well stamp and cut a bunch. A little bit of foam tape to pop that up, and this card is done. It's just a nice simple graphic card, but we may as well not waste the outside of our stitched flower. Let's make a slimline card next. You can see what a difference having a different background paper makes. Today I've chosen to go with this Eucalyptus Dance watercolour look paper. The holes on this die made me worry that the white foam tape might show through. So I'm just covering the holes with a piece of green paper first and then putting the foam tape on. I'm using one of the Rainbow Poppy's Happy Birthdays, and then once again just popping everything up with foam tape. You've seen me do it already this video. Let's use one of the negative spaces to make a quick shaker card. I've cut the piece down just a little and then cut a piece of blue paper from the same paper pad that we used earlier to be my background. Then I'm going to add a front window. I use recycled plastic packaging for this. It's not as stiff as the acetate that you buy, but it does the job just fine, and I like to recycle. Next, we need to use foam tape to make the walls all around our open shape. It's really important that these butt right up against each other so no sequins can escape. Once you've gone around the edge of your cutout shape, you can be a little bit more willy-nilly with the tape, which obviously I was. Then onto the shaker mix. Did anybody else used to love pulling sequins apart by sliding them between your fingers when they were a kid? I'd forgotten completely about doing that until I was playing with this mix. I'm going to use the centre from the die, and I'm cutting it out on a piece of paper which has double-sided tape at the back. Then it's simply a matter of adding my sentiment, which I've also mounted onto the same blue paper, and adding this to a card base. That's the end of the cards that I had in the pictures at the front, but I've got a sneaky little 50-second bonus card for you. This uses the Stitching Frames die, and I'm going to make a Christmas ornament by stitching horizontally across the shape and adding a little cross where the pokey out bits, that's the technical term, are on the side. Once I've done that, I've stitched around the outside and then turned around and stitched back again in the gaps from the first stitching. Basically a running stitch and then another running stitch in the gaps. And here we go, card construction in 20 seconds. I've used the Slimline Stitching Borders die to cut some holes in the coloured stripes on this paper, and then we're going to layer up nice and symmetrically from the outside in. Yellow, then white so that you can see the dots, then our striped cut paper, and then the stitched ornament and a sentiment, both backed in yellow. I'm going to leave you with some photos of the finished cards, as well as a few family shots of them. Feel free to like and subscribe if you'd care to, and I will be back soon with more cards. Bye for now.